Hello friends. For today's video, I wanted to go through a list of some adult fantasy that is not Brandon Sanderson. I am a big fan of Sanderson's works, but I know a lot of people already are very aware of Sanderson. They're pretty tired of hearing about him, and I know myself that I do talk about his works a lot, so I like to have videos like this to specifically highlight adult fantasy that is not Sanderson. A few things before we start. One, I've done this style of video many times, so if you're looking for other recommendations after this video, I'll have those other videos linked. Two, I know a lot of people have different things they're looking for within adult fantasy, different subgenres they gravitate towards. So I have a mix of different types of books on this list. And then third, I do recommend books even if they didn't personally work for me, just because I know people's tastes are so different. People are looking for different things in their works, and so I recommend it even if I didn't personally like it. So that's actually true for the first on the list. We have The Pariah by Anthony Ryan. If you recognize this author's name, it is likely from the book Bloodsong, which is a pretty well-known work within fantasy circles. I loved Bloodsong. I do like Anthony Ryan's writing. This one, we follow a young man who is caught up within basically a gang. There's a group of people that are outlaws that live within the forest, but they do have their own form of honor, their own code of honor within their group. There is this sense of brotherhood within their group, but we see something happen pretty early in the story that sets our main character off away from them, and he is now desiring revenge. And you see him go through a lot of trials in his life. He really doesn't have a lot of freedom or even a lot of agency within his own life, but he is caught within a lot of scheming, a lot of very powerful, very manipulative people. He's caught within their whims, you could say. And there is a decent amount of action. I am not usually the biggest fan of action. I like action in my stories, but I'm really gravitating toward action when specifically I care very much about the characters. The stakes are really high. It's been built up a lot. So I'm kind of very picky with my action. That said, my favorite part of this book, so this is probably the biggest compliment I can give it as somebody who doesn't care that much about action, my favorite part was an actual on-page battle that you get within the story. The build-up, the intensity leading up to that moment, and just seeing the enemy come toward them, the fear the characters had, and then the way that some of the other characters were reacting to it, and just the intensity of the fight itself, how chaotic the battle was. That part was truly gripping. So even though I didn't end up loving the book, I didn't really necessarily love the main character, I was very invested in that battle. And if you're somebody who likes stories that maybe are a little more meandering, you like following a morally gray character, you like characters that don't necessarily have that leadership role and that they're more caught up in what's going on with other people, you might really like this. I think a comparison I could make to some degree is something like Robin Hobb with Farseer, where you see Fitz not really have a lot of control over his own life. I think Fitz is maybe less morally gray than this character is, but I do think the writing style and the characters themselves, they kind of reminded me of each other. And then Combat Codes is definitely very action heavy. There is depth to it. I do feel like the characters, you clearly see that the adult main perspective, Murray is his name, he has a past. He kind of feels like he's washed up, done with all of that sort of a character, but he finds himself drawn back in. He's given hope and motivation through the other main perspective, which is a young boy who is forced in these fighting pits. And from there, there's a chance that he can ascend and start going to this prestigious school if Murray is willing to intervene and if he's willing to kind of draw from his previous battle experience. So there is depth to these characters, but really it's all about the next trial, the next fight, the fighting itself, how to build the skill. And I think if you're somebody who likes action heavy, you like a lot of fighting in your stories, you will like this one, especially if you like combat type of action, not necessarily magic intense action, but rather like hand-to-hand combat, that sort of thing, then I think you'll really like this. And the stakes do get raised over and over and over again. There's some twists and turns throughout the story that I think a lot of people are going to really like. It's very edge of your seat. Definitely if you're an action fan, it's going to probably be a page turner for you. And to me, it reminded me of if you were to mix Rage of Dragons with Hunter x Hunter a little bit, because I think the main characters are more likable than some of the characters you get in Age of Dragons, and there's kind of an innocence to some of them, like what you see in Hunter x Hunter, but that feeling of the trials and the constant fighting, that's where I get the comparison to Age of Dragons. After that, we have a romantasy, a fantasy romance that I'm sure a lot of you have seen, and that would be The Serpent and the Wings of Night. When it comes to fantasy romance, I think something that's difficult for a lot of people is you have people that want a lot of romance because maybe that's what they usually prefer in their stories, and maybe they tend to be romance readers. And then you have fantasy readers that want more of the fantasy, and they want more of the plot and the character development. And then romantasy, fantasy romance. Sometimes you would think it would appease both, but what can happen is it can disappoint everybody because it's not enough of what each group is looking for. So I think it can be very difficult actually to write a fantasy romance book that is appealing to both groups. And I think the reason this one has gained so much popularity is because I personally found it did accomplish both quite well. You actually follow the main character and you get to know her and you get to know the world through her for quite a while before romance is even a thought. And before the love interest is really seen as a love interest. The setup is that you follow this character who is a human who is living within the vampires, and the only way that she's managed to survive is because her father is the leader of the vampires, and so he's protected her, but she recognizes that she is only alive because of him. She wants some of her own power. She also wants to help him accomplish his goals. So she enters this competition, and if you win, then you are granted something through the favor of the goddess of the vampires. And there's a lot of cool vampire lore within the story. I think it had a combination of things that we expect from vampire stories while also including its own spin on vampires. So I did like that. It is also quite action heavy, given the fact that you're seeing our character enter these trials. But I thought her development, the relationships, the way they're challenged, I thought that was done well. And then because there was room for the characters to actually exist as independent from one another, because the characters had their own plotline, their own motivations, when you did start to see the romantic part of it come into the picture, I think it felt a lot more organic, and I found I cared more about it than when it's just kind of purely a physical attraction, like, oh my gosh, that person's so hot. After that, we have some stories that are very different from all the ones I've mentioned thus far. We have The Crane Husband and The Magician's Daughter. These have been two of my favorites that I've picked up this year. This one is a retelling of The Crane Wife. It's technically a novella, and it is a metaphor for domestic abuse. If that is something that you can connect with, that you've experienced, it can be cathartic to read something that's done in a way where it's not overly gruesome. It does evoke some memories for what that is like. So it can be challenging to read, but I also think for a lot of people, going through a story that highlights something, it helps them process it. But then also, if you've never experienced that, I think that this does a really good job of capturing the feeling. You follow a young girl, a teenage girl, whose mother brings home this crane, and it is sort of it's basically an animal version of a domestic abuse, of an abuser. And this crane is the abuser. That's what you gather from the story. It is very odd that it is in the shape of a crane and not necessarily just a human man. I think it's done intentionally. I think it has to do with the themes. I think you're seeing the way in which the effects of domestic abuse, how it impacts our main character's life, and that's more of the core of the story as opposed to the humanity and the motivation or anything like that of the abuser. I think that's part of why you see it in this animal form. It is, again, a retelling too of a folktale, so I think that plays a role as well. But it's very, very good. Highly recommend it. The Magician's Daughter, it's not challenging and depressing to read. The Magician's Daughter is, in my opinion, rather cozy, but also there are some things about it that I think thematically are kind of heavy. So you follow this young woman who is living in isolation on this island with a familiar and a magician who has raised her and is like a father figure. The familiar is for the magician, and he clearly has a past with other magicians. You don't really know all that much about him, but as the story progresses, you start to learn more about him, you learn more about his past, and you're seeing our main character find her place within the world, kind of gain her confidence, and it's a little bit of a coming-of-age story, but I think that the way that magic is part of the story and the way that our character is starting to see the world for what it is and gain empathy. She's already a sweet character, but just following her as her heart opens up, as she is exposed to so much of the hardships that people endure. I really, really liked all those aspects to it, and also the familiar is so cute. The familiar is so sweet, and if you're a fan of the animal companion mythological creature trope, I think you'll like that about that one quite a bit. Next up, we have another one that wasn't something that I loved, but a lot of people have really enjoyed this, and that would be One for My Enemy. This is a Romeo and Juliet West Side Story retelling. You are seeing two rival families, one of which is made up of these, well, they're both witches, but one family is primarily women, the other family is primarily men, and there's a lot to do with their financial power and how much they're able to control within this one part of the city. And you see these families right at the beginning kind of go head to head. There's this event that causes a lot of tension between them, and there was already a lot of tension brewing, and then things kind of just finally tip the scales into dangerous territory where they might start going after each other, killing each other. And you're following all these various different players within this story. The main two initially are the kind of Romeo and Juliet types where they find love within all of this hatred. And so you're seeing that, and pretty quickly, actually, it takes a turn. It doesn't continue necessarily with the Romeo Juliet West Side Story setup, but it goes in its own direction. It has the witches, it has fae, it has other magical things within it. And I thought the way that the author wove those things into the story did make it unique enough. The reason it didn't work for me, though, is just I don't like Romeo Juliet West Side Story. I'm just like, everybody's so stupid. But it is, I think, very melodramatic in a way I liked. I liked the drama of it. I liked the writing. I just didn't like the characters or the general setup pretty much at all. But if you do find that you like those kinds of stories, if you like the rival families and the two that find love within all of that, then this will probably be right up your alley. The last one I'm going to recommend is one that I could have sworn I had mentioned in one of these styles of videos, but I don't think I have, and I talk about it all the time, but I'm mentioning it again because it is so good, and that would be the Age of Uprising series. The second one is Engines of Chaos. The first one is Engines of Empire. This is criminally underrated, underhyped. It is so good. Well, the second one is not underrated. The second one has a very high average rating, but this series, it's just got pretty much everything I want in my epic fantasy. You have morally gray characters, you have really interesting maneuverings and posturing and politics, the economy, the way it's affected by what our characters are doing. You have magic in different places that you don't quite understand, the characters don't really understand, but you're discovering it alongside them. There's so many twists and turns. There's just so much to this. It's really what I want in epic fantasy. You follow the Hawksburg Guild, which is made up of a matriarch and her 3 children. They are adults, so they each have their own very captivating, interesting plot lines, which I think get even more interesting in the sequel. And then you follow a 5th perspective in the first book that I never want to say who that character is, because it's kind of a twist when you do get their perspective, and it kind of changes everything a little bit. Everything you thought you knew, you're like, oh, and everything gets flipped on its head. And the sequel opens up, you start to see more of the guilds, you start to see other individuals that are kind of players in a lot of the turmoil that is occurring, and you see the way some characters that were previously more villainous start to become more interesting, and you kind of want to follow them more, and you're kind of rooting for them, and then other characters that were kind of the good guys are suddenly becoming more villainous. But it's just kind of the constant twists and turns, which I really love. I can't recommend the series enough. Definitely check it out if you're a fan of epic fantasy. But that's it for some adult fantasy works that are not Sanderson. Like I said, I've done this many times, so I'll have the other videos linked. And if you have any of your own recommendations, of course, feel free to leave those in the comment section down below. Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.